Hey yo everyone, gather around. It's story time. Brought to you by the University of Alaska Fairbanks, Department of Social Work, and a Conscious Party Productions. You are listening to The Critical Social Worker, a revolutionary storytelling podcast.
A conscious party.
Revolutionizing our minds.
Elevating our consciousness.
Changing our worlds.
Your story.
My story.
Our story.
All right. Welcome officially to episode 37 of The Critical Social Worker, a revolutionary storytelling podcast. First of all, I want to introduce my co-host, Doris, who's here with me. Doris is a social work student, but Doris is like one of those students that actually already had an amazing career and came back because she wanted to. You're a psychology student with a minor in social work. How are you this morning, Doris?
I'm doing good.
Yeah. Thanks for being here with us this morning.
Thanks. Thanks for inviting me.
Just real quick, what career did you switch over from?
So I worked for a couple of Native nonprofits here locally and a lot of executive management. My last position was as an executive director for a scholarship foundation. And I was getting to a point where I just had this passion to support people in a different manner, my Alaska Native people. And so I went back to school, took the leap and went back to college at a later age. And I'm enjoying it so much. I really am.
Yeah, well, it's been a pleasure to have you in class and get to know you. Students like you are the best kind, in my opinion, just because you bring such a wealth of knowledge and experience already to the classroom. Whereas I'm not saying that folks that are 18, 19, 20, they don't have that, but you definitely have a lot more and a lot more to contribute in terms of experience. And so it's always a pleasure.
I gotta say, just going to school with a younger generation, I can't believe I'm saying younger generation, but wow, the future is bright. I mean, they are sharp. Oh my goodness. And just seeing just everybody, but going to school with some of the Alaska Native groups, wow, very sharp kids.
Yeah. Yeah, we have a great student population, especially, with how many Alaska Native students. I'm not sure what the population or what the percentage is, but it's a good percentage. And we'll talk about that, but we focus on that in the program. I talk about it in the pre-podcast. All right, we're also here with Vikki Reynolds, and you're calling in from Vancouver, right?
I'm in the territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people in what is understood as Vancouver and what is understood as Canada. Yeah.
Yeah, how are you this morning?
Oh, I'm good. I'm really excited to be here. I'm very humbled by this call, and Doris and I have already had a nice check-in, so I'm pretty jazzed for what's going to happen. I don't know what's going to happen. I like that.
Yeah, well, nobody does. We'll see where it goes. One of the things I always like to start off with is the natural environment and, give people a perspective. And for us, also gives us an opportunity to reflect on where we're at and whatnot. And Doris is just up the road from me. I guess I don't know what you call it, up the road, down the road in the North Pole, right?
Yep, I'm North Pole.
So North Pole is just kind of like a subsidiary of Fairbanks. I don't want to offend anybody who wants to be independent of Fairbanks, but, it's within the greater Fairbanks area. And we've actually been experiencing pretty warm weather for Fairbanks this time of year, right? Like usually we're around 0 or below 0, but we've been in the 20s. I think it's in the 20s this morning, or close to that. So that's been a blessing. One of the things I've been struggling with though is we're in the deep stages of the descent into darkness and cold weather, and so we lose about 5 minutes of daylight every day, I think. And you can see the sun should rise up behind me here at some point in the podcast. But how is it where you're at, Vikki? I assume that you have similar weather to Southeast Alaska, lots of rain.
Yeah, we have lots of rain. It's been super foggy and cold lately. It's really turned from fall into winter, and the days are short. It's been everything's closing down, a lot of raking leaves and trying to protect the garden for the next year. And it's getting dark, cold, wet days, as it should be, moving towards the solstice, right?
Yeah, I actually we spent about a year in Southeast Alaska, and I was surprised at how dark it got. I didn't think that it got down to like 4.5 hours, I think, of daylight. And I was surprised by that because it's quite it's like I think almost 1,000 miles south of where we're at.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. Well, we're all moving down into the descent of darkness to some degree. I even remember when I grew up in the Midwest, I struggled in the winter, I think it got dark at like 5 p.m., like 9 to 5. We had daylight from 9 to 5, and that was hard for me. Have you always lived here in the area, Doris?
I was born and raised in the area. I'm originally from a village called Dot Lake and biologically from Northway. And so that's that whole area right next to the Canadian border.
Okay.
Right past Delta. Yeah. So I've got all kinds of family down in that area. Toke, Dot Lake, Northway, Tetland, some family in Eagle, Peely Lake, that area.
So if you take that alternative route to Anchorage, I have never done it, but I've tried to MapQuest it and look at it. Would you go through there? Is it on the road system?
Yeah, it's it's a lot more mountains. And so there's a lot more higher road. It makes me a little bit more nervous. The parks here is a little treacherous, but once you get past that, the road's way better. But it's beautiful.
Yeah, I bet. Well, Vikki, have you always been in the Vancouver area?
No, not at all. I grew up in the east end of Toronto, a place called Scarborough, which is kind of a joke, working class neighborhood. Yeah, and I lived in Botswana, Africa for a bunch of years as a teacher. I was there as a teacher in the 80s. Then my partner got a scholarship to Berkeley, so I went and lived in the United States in Berkeley for a year, which was an education. Then from there, we decided we couldn't live in the States, so we came to Canada, and we moved to Vancouver kind of sight unseen, and we've been here for, I guess, 35 years. Yeah.
So you got me interested just because you're talking about Berkeley. Berkeley's kind of synonymous in the American consciousness with resistance and kind of like liberal type of resistance and whatnot. When did it start for you? I know this is episode 37, and the title of it's Bridging Activism and Therapy. So where did the activism, how did that get started for you?
Oh, I just always, I just can't remember not. My mom was actually a union activist when it was a very dangerous time to do that. She was a telephone operator. She was very quiet about it. I don't think everybody in our family even knows that what she was doing was trying to do union organizing, around. And I was involved in work as a teenager around choice, birth control, and access to women's health, because I was a young Irish Catholic girl, and that was not a possibility for us. So then, just I think class politics, and I think so. I went to university. I was in high school, and I figured education was a way. I don't know. Going to university seemed like a way for me to move out of some of the places I was in. So I went and got it. I was part of student union during university, of course, and doing those kind of struggles. But I went to Botswana, Africa, right out of university to be a teacher. And while I was there, Botswana is on the edge of South Africa. While I was 24 when I was there, and Nelson Mandela was in prison. South Africa was under a state of emergency. It was under apartheid. And there was a lot of struggles about that. There were a lot of refugees in my village who were political people from South Africa, from both Stephen Biko's Black Consciousness movement, but also the ANC with Nelson Mandela. And these folks really gave me a huge education. That's when I actually figured out that I was white. Took me till I was 24. Because before then I was a working class woman who had been with a lot of money struggle to try to go through university. So I had really precarious jobs. So I experienced a lot of violence from men. That's what happens when you're waitressing till 3 a.m. and hitchhiking home, right? That's how it happened. And so I had those experiences. Kind of my identity was more around my own, of course, sites of oppression, because I was trying to get out of that. When I went to Botswana, man, that's when I figured out I'm actually, the whole time I was in those struggles, I was a white person. And that's why it went as well as it did for me. So there was a massive awareness and starting to get into the intersections of identity there. From there, we went to Berkeley, and I had did some things, but I became very involved it was 1989, and the state of California was bringing back the death penalty. And so I got involved in the movement against the death penalty. At the time, I was also involved in action against AIDS, because AIDS hit Africa while I was living there. I travel a lot, and I never go back to Botswana, just because our whole family was decimated. The family we lived with, my students from that. So AIDS was my issue at first, and things like Queer Nation and ACT UP had a massive influence on me, especially the drama and bringing the festival and the theater to it. But at the same time, that state brought back the death penalty, and I remember thinking, as a person, as a human, as an activist, I can't have this blood on my hands unrecognized. So I got totally involved. What I did with the next 10 years of my life was be really a part of Amnesty International's campaign against the death penalty in the United States. I worked for about 20 guys on death row, and they were all executed. So that was kind of, I don't know, it's interesting, eh? You're involved in the struggles you are in, and then people mentor you and welcome you in. So that's kind of the beginnings for me. At that time, I never thought I'd be a therapist or a professor.
Well, I'm curious, because you mentioned Amnesty International. Weren't they involved with the Mumia Abu Jamal case back in the 90s?
I have a picture of Mumia Abu Jamal that I'm pointing at right now. So freeing Mumia and getting Mumia Abu Jamal off of death row was a huge campaign I was involved in. We did get Mumia Abu Jamal off death row, but he is incarcerated for the rest of his life, which is absolutely torture and political violence. So I'm not okay with that. Mumia Abu Jamal, as you know, had a radio show called Live from Death Row, and he's written a book on that. It just such a brilliant analysis. I would actually say Mumia Abu Jamal is one of the people, as an abolitionist, Mumia Abu Jamal's language and analysis bring in all of that, especially from the perspective of the specificity of anti-Black racism. Because most of the guys on death row I was working for were white, or I guess they were called Hispanic. They might have identified that way. But Mumia Abu Jamal's work really, really mattered to me. So that's it. Yeah, I've been part of that struggle for always. But that was the height of a lot of the work I did for a bunch of years, because as a Canadian, because I'm not an American, as a Canadian, I was able to have, Amnesty doesn't let you work in your own country on everything necessarily, because the point is to have witnesses from other places. I would just say Amnesty International is an organization I have respect for, but I was working on death row there for the death penalty, because I thought it was actually the most liberatory politics they're involved in. I think there's a role for Amnesty, but I'm also identify as a direct action activist, and that's kind of, we can wear many hats, right, Christian?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And, organizations like Amnesty International have been around for a long time, and they can change over time. And so it's hard to, to place what they're doing in, say, the 90s versus what they're doing now, and how much it's changed and evolved.
Well, what they did is they moved from having white leadership to having leadership from people of color from other parts of the world. That's what actually, that momentum and that leadership actually was spectacular. And, at one point, actually, when I first moved to Canada, I was going to leave Amnesty, because at that time, they did not accept people as prisoners of conscience who were queer, two-spirit, or transgender. And what they were saying was, well, we have people who are queer. What they were saying then was gays and lesbians, because it was a long time ago. People who are gay and lesbian are under, are prisoners of conscience, but not for that. It's for their political work or for something else. So I was involved in a campaign, which was, our job was to get Amnesty International to accept people who were gay, lesbian, but also, queer and non-binary and two-spirit, accepted as prisoners of conscience. And that worked. Of course it worked, because it had to, or else we're not standing up for anything, right? So that was the other big piece I did with Amnesty. Yeah. I'm a straight cisgendered person, but so much of my activism has been informed by Queer Nation, ACT UP, the struggle for AIDS and stuff like that, that it really radically informed me. Mm. Yeah, how to meet hate in tiaras and high heels. Wow. It's just like brave and courageous. Drag queens in particular, right, on the streets in San Francisco, where the police were just brutal, and just meeting it with love. and seeing the theater of it, and thinking about Emma Goldblum, right, who says, yeah, if I can't dance at your revolution, I'm not coming. That joy has to be a sight. We have to structure this into our analysis of our resistance. That for me really comes. I owe that to the queer community, and yeah, in particular the non-binary community, I'd say.
Doris, did you have something to say? It looked like it. I just don't want to.
Oh no, that's just really powerful. Like what you just said was really powerful. That just the concept that you can, be in activism and be in a peaceful protest or a protest, and you can still find, joy and love in what you're doing. It's not something that has to be just, anger and hate. That's beautiful.
Yeah, while you say that, what you got me thinking of is like, I am sometimes asked about, because I believe in a really sacred spiritual practice. I believe therapy, whatever it is we're doing in community work, I believe this relational work is a sacred practice. I believe in making room for the sacred. But when people ask me about my own relationship to spirituality or whatever, I was brought up Irish Catholic, and of course I have a lot of there's cultural things about that still matter. My father had last rites, and that was meaningful for all of us. But I, of course, have a real critique of that Catholic Church and the harms, in particular in the territories I'm living in, about residential schools and the torturing of children, and our participation as a Catholic Church in that, and their inability to be accountable to that. So that's not what I'm talking about. But for me, what I would say is, I was just thinking the other day, I was on the homelessness march, and there's a lot of them, but, on the homelessness march, when you go on the, Earth Day march, there's like thousands and thousands of people, and the police are just there to stop the cars. When you go on the homelessness march, there's more police officers than activists. And they're there to stop you. and it's not fun, and it's not a good relationship, and it's precarious. Not for white-housed people like me, who are acting in solidarity, but for homeless people on that march. And I just think about, there might be 200 or 60 people on that march, but I know if the police try to, circle anybody, everybody on that march is going to act with revolutionary love and get between the police and that person. And I don't even need to know everybody's name. I know who you are because you're on that march, and I have revolutionary love for you, and I feel held for you. That for me is joyful. That feels sacred. That whole march is a moving church for me. That's actually, that's how, and I just, that's those things, Doris. I don't want to fetishize particular pieces of activism, but there is something about community gatherings and the mutual aid of that, that actually have been the thing that have kept me alive in the work. I'm 60. I'm 62. Yeah. Yeah.
A moving church. Wow.
Yeah, kind of, or some kind of sacred ceremony. It's just a love fest, right? It is. Even though it's hard and dark and there's parts of it that are scary, there's people who refuse to be intimidated, and they always inspire me, and, just try to do the right thing even when it's hard, Yeah. I got big respect for that, I love the solidarity. For me, I guess, is how I would describe my spirituality. I love the idea that I don't need to know who someone is, and I don't need to know their name. I know their heart because they're here and they're taking these actions, Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. I think of that as communion,
I think.
That isn't.
Go ahead, Doris.
That just inspires me because I'm not really, I kind of sit back and watch people who are activists, or, they're on the front line and they're speaking and everything. And I've always thought, wow, in this world, there's different roles that people have, I feel like, in this world, and we need, some people will label that as radical, or, however it kind of comes across for that person. And I'm thinking, and not everybody is like that, but, I was thinking, wow, we really need people to speak up and have a voice like that. And just talking with you, and I never thought that I was that kind of a person, but just talking with you just now, it kind of inspired me, like, maybe there is a place for me here.
You know, what I think has really been amazing, I don't know if this fits in, Christian, but we'll just jump with this because it's what you've got me thinking, Doris. Like historically, you know, like certainly death penalty work, the campaign for Mumia Abu-Jamal. I've been the clinical supervisor at the Center of Survivors of Torture, so I've done a lot of speaking on behalf of refugees and migrant justice and stuff like that. But you know what's happened since Idle No More? You know the Idle No More movement, Indigenous people in response to residential schools and First Nations coordinate. It started in Canada, but went across the world with Indigenous folks. Idle No More was the first things I showed up at where you show up at an event and then the kind of the white people stay here and then the people of color moved in and then the Indigenous people moved in and then the matriarchs and the Indigenous women moved to the center and spoke at the mic. I had never seen that as an activist. And that became the movement. And it centered who needs to be speaking, who is really on the front lines. It's communities of struggle that's a front line, not who's speaking into a mic. And then Black Lives Matter, centering Black lives, which is what Steve Biko talked about in Black Consciousness, fighting apartheid in South Africa in the 1970s and 80s, right? Black Consciousness, what Steve Biko said was, Black people are going to liberate Black people. And I was 24, I'm like, wow, they don't want me in their movement? They're like, no, you go work with white people. You got all kinds of work to do. We don't need you at the mic leading our movement. And a Black man explained this to me so brilliantly. He said, can you imagine being at a movement or a rally or a gathering about women's rights and having men at the mic all the time? I was like, no. He's like, that's what it's like for us as Black people. Just get out of the way.
Wow.
That was a brilliant education. But watching Idle No More and watching, you know, that's been I think the biggest influences on me right now in movement work have been Idle No More and Black Lives Matter and seeing communities of struggle, you know, obviously at the forefront of the risk and the vulnerability and the precariousness, but also that's the wisdom leading, yeah? Which influences all your organizing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a bunch of thoughts, but you know, I think for white people that get involved in some kind of resistance, or especially when you're talking about, like, you had a good example with Black liberation or anything to do, you know, Black Lives Matter, that, you know, that area. I think there's some sparks that happen and they wake up a little bit, or I should say we wake up a little bit, and you want to be involved, right? And you want to, like, you realize these things for some of the first time, and you're like, oh, I'm charged up and I'm ready to go help the Black revolution. And like you said, then oftentimes you could be told, you know, well, you might have a different place than right here at the front of our revolution or whatever. And it can feel hurtful. And so I think then white people can feel, you know, they can feel a little bit, I hate to throw around the term, but they can feel a bit fragile, and they can feel like excluded. And I heard Ta-Nehisi Coates give an answer one time that I think is relevant here. And somebody was asking him in the audience. They were asking him about the N-word and why, like, if it's in rap music and whatnot, why white people can't use it. And he gave a good answer about, you know, well, I got he threw out this answer. I have some white friends, and they have this. They have this house that they go out to, like, vacation to, this cabin in the woods somewhere, and they call it the white trash house or something like that. I can't remember what it was. But they call it that, but I wouldn't call it that because it's not my place to call it that, if that makes sense. And then he talks about, like, even, you know, if you had a partner and you called them babe or something like that, well, you don't want everyone calling them babe, if that makes sense. And so he said, a problem with white people oftentimes is they think, oh, you know, which has been put into our consciousness from many different sources, many different ways. We think that we should have access and we should have ownership rights to pretty much everything. And the fact is that we don't. And you can have different perspectives on the N-word, for example, but Black folks have reclaimed it, and it's our word, and you're not invited to use it, if that makes sense. And to me, I think at the stage where I'm at, that's easy for me to accept. But I know that for many white folks, in different stages, that can be hard. It can just be hard to accept that you're not included when you know, white people are included in everything. You know, we white people, for example, you know, when I was watching movies and television and everything else, you know, I got to see white people reflected time and time and time and time and time again, where that's not always the case. And so I think as white people, you know, we have to find a way that we can find solidarity, we can be comrades, you know, you can be allies. There's a number of different ways that you can look at it. You know, I had a black nationalist named Haki Shakur on the last episode of the podcast, or one of the last episodes anyways. And, you know, I thought that was a good example of a white guy and a black nationalist being able to work together, be comrades, have dialogue, move forward together in spaces while still maintaining separate spaces, if that makes sense. And so I was just wondering, Vikki, if you can give any context to that, if you have any stories, if you have any insights on how you've navigated, you know, how is your personal, because I'm sure you've had some of these roadblocks in your own consciousness and in your own life. There's no way to go about it. If you get from here to here, you had to go through some of those things. So I was just wondering, can you give us any insight, any stories, whatever you have for us?
Yeah. Well, I got, like, I've just taken it as an education. I went to Aotearoa, New Zealand, when I first wanted to become a therapist, because because of my activism, I got hired to be the clinical supervisor at a center for survivors of torture. I wasn't the world's greatest therapist. I just had a master's degree. I didn't know everything about trauma, but I was an activist. And that's what they really wanted was. So I was really concerned about white supremacy and being, you know, as a white therapist, there's no way I wasn't smuggling white supremacy into every conversation with every refugee and every survivor of torture I was seeing. And I was seeing people from over 45, quote, countries, also some places that aren't identified as countries because they were struggling for independence, right? So I went out to Aotearoa, New Zealand to study with these folks at a place called the Family Center. It was called the Just Therapy Center, meaning justice has to be a part of therapy, and it's just therapy. We're no more important than your hockey team or the reading club, or, you know, we're just, you know, one thing. So I like that. They had Pakeha, which is white settler. They had 3 sections: the Pakeha section, the Maori, which are the indigenous people of Aotearoa, New Zealand, Maori people, and Pacific Islanders, and Samoan and Pacific Islanders. So Kiwi Tamasisi led the Samoan section, and Mother Truth, Flora Tahaka, was a Maori elder who led the Maori section. And I went to a workshop with the 2 of them, and there was a whole bunch of therapists there. And you'll like this story, Christian, because this would be you and Doris. I think you would be there. So we're all in there, and we're trying to learn basically about cultural accountability. And this is a really long, 25 years ago, so before people weren't talking about this stuff in therapy, right? White supremacy was just, professionalism was capital P. This was just so out there. So anyway, they asked, like, who, you know, we're going to do all this as live therapy. So who's going to be the therapist? Well, nobody wanted to be the therapist. So I put my hand up because, like, shit, I came here to learn. I didn't come here to save myself, you know. So anyway, I started to do therapy. And Flora Tahaka would just say, stop. Just stop. You're just being white. You're just being white. Well, 25 years ago, nobody was calling people white. You know, I was like, fair enough. And then she would say, what do you think you're doing wrong? And I'd be like, I don't have a clue, you know, and and she would say, everybody else, like, what do you think? There were some Aboriginal people there. There were some Maori people there. There were primarily Pakeha people there. People didn't have many ideas. And she was unpacking white supremacy for us in the way it shows up in therapy and giving us, giving us a lot of critique, giving me a lot of critique. And then, Kiwi Tamasisi, who's Samoan, was just like, here's, whoa, stop. Here's what you're doing. Like, just very clear, right? Speaking very clearly about white supremacy, about the role of it in psychotherapy, about the ways that, we're abusing power in, not just in ways of being the therapist with a client, but in ways of being a white therapist. Anyway, on the second day, a white woman stopped the whole thing and said, I just have to stop this. I just have to say, 'cause nobody else volunteered to be the therapist, so I was getting this critique all the time. A white woman stood up and said, we got to stop this. I'm not okay with how Vikki's being, it's just not okay what's happened to Vikki. Now the language you would say was white fragility. It's like, you're hurting Vikki's feelings and, that kind of stuff. And I can see she's emotional about this, because I was. I was like, oh shit, I've done something wrong. I explain it as just spiritual pain that I transgressed ethics. That's how I feel about it. And she's like, we have to stop. And Flora Tahaka said, "Well, Vikki, what do you think we've been picking on you?" And I said, "No, this is what I came here for. I know I'm doing things wrong. I just don't know what I'm doing wrong. So this is exactly what I came here for, right?" And I just remember Kiwi Tamasisi saying to this woman, like, she was like, "Well, I wouldn't be okay with you talking to me like that." And Kiwi said, "I wouldn't talk to you like that. You've never taken any risks or chances or said anything here. You're not open to any critique. You know, you're going to get just what you came for. You're going to leave here learning nothing, you know." And Vikki's going to get what she came here for. She came here to try to not harm people because she's working entirely with different cultures, and she's white the whole time she's doing it, and she's causing a lot of harm. And she doesn't want to do that. So, you know, that's what she's here for. Just naming it, just like that. And then, you know, other conversations that Kiwi Tamasisi, the Samoan therapist, said to me, a critique, especially across from a colonized woman of color to a white woman settler, a critique that she offers me is a gift that is given at her expense and to my benefit. Like 25 years ago, at the very beginning of my therapy career, I was gifted with these two women of color who had been colonized, their generosity of spirit and their heart, you know, loving me and helping me be a better human being and helping me do less harm in not just with people of color, and not just with colonized people, but with all the people that I work with. It's invaluable to me. That I'll never forget that. Someone framing that as kind of white fragility, and then Kiwi saying, "Actually, you're receiving gifts. And you have to receive that with a spirit of generosity and understand that that really influenced everything. That just influenced everything, Christian." Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that. It makes me think, you know, I'm a PhD student in Indigenous Studies program here at University of Alaska Fairbanks. And it's my first, I switched over from a different program. So I've been a PhD student for a while, but it's my first semester here. And I'm in a couple of classes, and one of them is a little bit more mixed up. It's mostly Indigenous Alaska Native folks, but the other one is exclusively Alaska Natives, except for myself. And I found myself going through a similar process that I'd went through before. When I first moved to Alaska a long time ago, back in the early 2010s, and was a student, I got involved in a thing called the Rural Human Services program. And what they did was they took, similar to the rural cohort that I teach now, but they brought in mostly Alaska Native students from all across the state of Alaska, and they'd bring us in for a week 2 weeks at the beginning of the semester and 2 weeks at the end, and then we would meet over the phone in between. This is before the Zoom days. And back then, I remember going through this process. You know, I didn't really know what I was doing there, I guess, when I first showed up, but they facilitated talking circles, and so there was like between 30 and 40 people there. So these talking circles can go on for a long time. And at first I didn't, and I tell this story all the time, but at first I couldn't stand them. You know, they took too long. I felt like people were whining. I had other things to do. I had homework. I was hungry, and all of these things. But over participating in them for several years, over time I became a part of the circle. I like to use the term a part of it. And so over time I became a part of it. I didn't become it. I just became a part of it. And then I'm thinking about, I went through a similar process this time. I was in the first couple months in the Indigenous Studies program. I show up, I have this good attitude. I'm there for the right reasons, but I'm not accepted right off the bat. I'm not saying like I was, completely rejected, but I definitely wasn't just like, arm around me and hey, welcome to the club, buddy. It was, it took more time. But it was so good for me because it made me revisit all of those feelings that I had before of inclusion and where's my place and, where can I contribute and, entitlement of the feeling entitled to be accepted for who I knew I was and the things that I've done, but everybody else doesn't know that. You have to earn that trust. And so it was a really good process for me to go again over the last few months, to be there and to have to reintegrate myself and revisit all of those fears and like I said, those feelings of entitlement and whatnot. And so I feel like going back through that again and being challenged, not directly challenged, but it was a challenge nonetheless. It was really good for me and allowed me to move forward, not only in my studies, but spiritually and as a human being. So I think it's important we tell these stories, and we realize that it takes time, and it's like it's circular. You're going to have to go through the process again and again and again and again in different processes, and it takes a lot of courage and strength and self-reflection and whatnot to be able to to navigate these multiple spaces.
Easy, right? And sometimes it's just easy. Like sometimes
it is
it's
easy.
not so loaded, right? Like I think about this amazing activist Sid Chow-Tan, Chinese Canadian. He's one of the people who started the head tax activism here. We had laws that in Canada, as you had in the States, that didn't allow Chinese people to immigrate. We brought Chinese people as like indentured servants almost, and they had to pay back their travel and stuff. Didn't let them bring their families, didn't let them bring their children. They couldn't be citizens. And to bring a family member, you had to pay the price of a house. It was called a head tax to bring a family member over. This is the way we impoverished the Chinese community, right? As a nation, after they built the railroad. So Sid was really a big part of that. But he and we were activists connected to all kinds of movement struggle together. And I remember we were at one big event and I was speaking, I was at the mic, so it was a long time ago, about migrant justice. And I was speaking about Tibetans. I've been connected with the Canada-Tibet Committee. Tibet was invaded by China, like in the 50s, and there was genocide, which is ongoing. And the Tibetans had to go into exile in India. I've since then been at the Center for Survivors of Torture with the Tibetans in exile. So I've been connected there. So I'm speaking about the Tibetans in exile. And I was speaking about, I think maybe I was speaking about Polchan, a monk brother of mine, and talking about other people, how they were tortured by the Chinese state, by the Chinese government. But I didn't say that. What I said is they were tortured by the Chinese. And the speech went really well, and there was applause. And at the end of it, Sid Chow-Tan was at the bottom waiting for me, and he said, "Vic, can I give you a word?" And he didn't give me, the shit sandwich. Nice earrings. I thought you were racist. The boots are good too. The shit sandwich, like that kind of critique. He didn't do that. He didn't start by, "Oh, that was so good. Can I say something?" He's like, "Vic, you got a minute? I need to talk to you." I said, "Yeah." He said, "You said the Tibetan monks were tortured by the Chinese. I'm the Chinese. I didn't torture anybody. You're my partner." He said, "Your partner's an American. You can tell the difference between the American foreign policy and individual Americans. But that's because he's white. But you block all of Chinese people together. That's white supremacy. And so what you need to say is the Chinese government tortured Tibetans, not Chinese. And we put up with a lot of anti-Chinese racism here. We don't need it from you. We need you to clean that. I need you to clean that up." And I felt that. But what I felt was spiritual pain that I had harmed Sid Chow-Tan. I didn't feel fragile about myself at all. I believe that what I was feeling was spiritual pain. Here's the ethics I'm a part of. Here's what I've done. And Sid is letting me know that. This is a gift to me. So, and then I said, "Okay, I get it. Thanks. That wasn't my intention." And he said, "Your intentions don't matter. What matters is the impact of what you said, right? We got to fix this." I said, "I appreciate it." He said, "I'm telling you this because I love you and I need you in the movement." I said, "Okay." And then he said, it took that long, 3 minutes? And then he just said, "Are we good then? Can we go pick up all the posters? Because there were all these things. Or are we going to sit here and talk about this shit?" I was like, "No, Sid, we're going to go pick stuff up." That's the last time we talked about it. It landed. I hold on to it really quick. It's one of those stories I hold on to, Christian, that I felt so respected by Sid. He didn't treat me like I was a fragile person who's going to lose their shit because he's telling me that I did something so hurtful. That was a beautiful interaction. And we were in solidarity together until Sid passed. And that's what I love him for. When I did my PhD, I wrote that story up in my book and I co-authored it with Sid. I sent it to him and then he wrote more into it and stuff. And then he said, "Can I publish this in the Chinese activist paper?" So he actually took it and published somewhere. So it's a story we ended up co-authoring for my PhD, which I really love that fact. And he was proud of us and our relationship and our revolutionary love that withstood that, the fact that it was showing folks you don't we can help each other do this better. This is what solidarity looks like. It's not always pretty. It's not always a hug and a warm muffin, Sometimes it's having the moral courage to tell something what they have done is absolutely hurtful, and to not, like I said, not back it up with the shit sandwich. Just bring it. So in activism, we know how to do that because we're not there for paid work. It's not complicated, our relationships. We're there in solidarity to try to move things forward for justice. And so I think bridging that into therapy, Christian, is what I try to do. I think my work has been trying to move the solidarity ethics from social justice movements into the stuff that gets called community work or social work or therapy or whatever. That's always been what I'm trying to do, is bring that ethic of sustainability and ethics, collective care, mutual aid, bring that into therapy, right? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And I'm going to table the transition to therapy for just a second, just because I had some thoughts. So I really appreciated your story, and I had something that just left me. But you were saying about the man that approached you, and the designation between, or the distinction between the Chinese people and the Chinese government, for example. And it makes me think of what's happening right now. And so let me state this first of all. One of the goals and principles of this podcast is to avoid partisan politics, but that doesn't mean we can't talk about politics at all. And one of the things that I have incorporated into the last 4 or 5 episodes was talking about the current situation, Israel, Palestine. And your comments made me think about other distinctions that I see. And I'm no expert on these situations, but I feel like it's important to talk about them and work them out just for my own benefit. But I hear the distinctions between, or I guess I see people conflating Hamas and Palestine or Gaza for one, and then there was even just a resolution passed in Congress yesterday, I think, where it was considered anti-Semitic to equate Zionism with, or to be anti-Zionist was anti-Semitic. And I just wondered, what do you think about that, like in the current dialogue or the current discourse of today and what's going on? How important is it for us to make distinctions and to be careful about the language that we're using?
Well, I take my lead from Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn, right, who are actually both Jewish academics and activists and stuff. So I think Noam Chomsky is saying the most sense-making things right now that I'm hearing around this. So, I think it's really important that, like Howard Zinn says, right, you can't stay neutral on a moving train. Angela Davis, Black abolitionist from the United States, says, what is going on in Palestine right now is the litmus test for our humanity. It may be the biggest thing we face in our lifetimes in terms of where we are as human beings in this world, like what side we're on, not on the side of humanity. For me, I'm not subjected to American media. I'm not saying Canadian media is any better. I get my information from alternative sources. I believe the media, I don't know if it's a rule or it's just the policy or it's just how they're doing it. They're not saying Palestine, they're saying Gaza. And they're not saying Palestine, they're saying Hamas. So they're refusing, it's just like a reality fact check here, right? There's not a war going on. A war is two armies that are fighting each other. There's one place has a war, an army, and someone doesn't. I think as a white settler in the territories that I live in, I was given a workshop yesterday, and I started this way, Christian, and it's how I've been ever since the attacks on Palestine have been escalated after the massacre of Israeli citizens by Hamas. As a white settler in these territories, I work very hard. When I make a land acknowledgement of what territory I'm in, I need to think about, as a white settler, what am I implicated in? How am I benefiting? How do I stay implicated in the catastrophes of white supremacy, of colonization and occupation? And so in solidarity means you make connections with things. And so then I have to be in solidarity with Indigenous land defenders here in the territories I'm in. That requires that I also have an understanding of Indigenous land defenders and people under occupation in Palestine. So for me, that's like required for me if I'm going to take a stand of being in solidarity with occupied Indigenous people here. Solidarity says you make connections. And so I believe that we have to absolutely have a ceasefire, but we also have to look at this as occupation. But for countries like the United States, Canada, New Zealand, Aotearoa, and Australia, we are occupying, colonizing countries. And there's a reason we're the people who are blocking the United Nations move to call for a ceasefire, because it's our politics that are being replicated here. We are implicated in this. So that's how I think about it. How is my privilege mapped onto this struggle? I am a settler in an occupied nation. And when people have tried to do land, the land defenders in this province are being met with state violence. We are replicating these practices, right? So I don't, it's not anything I'm articulate about, but I do not believe in any way that it is anti-Semitic to be against the atrocities that are going on against the occupied, independent, Indigenous state of Palestine. I think that is absolutely, that's crazy making language. I can't, anyway. So I think it's really important that we're not neutral about this, right? And like I said, Howard Zinn says you can't be neutral on a moving train. And this is one, and this is hard. And this is going to be hard, but it's so many people are not talking about this just because they're at risk of being uncomforted. They actually don't have any, they're not the people at risk here. Like an ethical dialogue requires that you track vulnerability, see who's most vulnerable and center them. That would be Palestinians that would have to be at the heart. How are my actions holding on to that, right? Yeah. I don't know if I've made sense there, Christian.
No, you have. I appreciate you sharing your thoughts and adding a lot of context. I think, as I reflected on this a couple weeks ago as well, but as a white guy living in Alaska, I'm largely separated from all this stuff. You know what I mean? So it could be very easy just to avoid looking at it, avoid dealing with it. And I'm like you, I don't watch the news, the mainstream news, but sometimes I see a clip or something that somebody posts, but for the most part, I don't watch it. And so I don't know what everyone else is hearing all the time and what everyone else is privy to, or, whatever propaganda is being spewed to the rest of the world. I don't always know about that. And so, I think you mentioned Angela Davis, and I had a class with her, and she was in town in Oahu for a fellowship that she had, and she guest taught our class for the semester. So that was an incredible experience. And she has a book called, this was I shouldn't say way before any of this was going on, because it wasn't, but it was before the current escalation of there you go. Freedom is a Constant Struggle. That had just come out, I think, in 2016 when I had the class with her. And so that's a good book. It's just full of speeches and whatnot, but it gives a lot of good context about Palestine. So I encourage folks to check it out. Angela Davis is just somebody you could also look up on YouTube and listen to some of the speeches she has about it. She's been involved in that struggle for quite some time. So I just wanted to throw that.
I think that's what's important. Out. I think that's what's important, Christian, is acknowledging that conversation was from 2013. Like you said, this is something that some people have just had come into their awareness this year, but this is a struggle that's been going on forever. Doris, I'm just wondering, you have two white people talking about occupation here, and I am just wondering what you're making of any of this.
I just had a couple thoughts about, one of them was when you were talking about ethical dialogue. Oh my goodness. Like in just talking and finding out who the vulnerable people are and bringing them into balance. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think that's a frame for therapy, right? In any therapeutic conversation, that's the activism I'm trying to bring, is centering ethics in all of our conversations. So tracking vulnerability. Judith Butler, queer theorist from the United States, talks about, in a book she wrote on 9/11, she talked about grievable lives, which, after 9/11, when 3,000 people died, America started a war in Iraq because they wanted to. And this was their excuse for it, right? Which is some of what's going on now. And she talked about precarious lives, that there's some people's lives that aren't even worth mourning. We think about how many people in the United States and Canada are dying of poison drugs from bad drug policy. Like, it's massive. In my city in Vancouver, 8 people every day are dying of poison drugs because we don't have a clean drug supply. 20 people every day in Canada. It's been going on for 8 years. Those are ungrievable. They don't count. When you say, oh, my son died. Oh, that's tragic. What did he die of? Oh, he died of an overdose. And like, oh, yeah, okay. That meaning, yeah, that's not a life we're going to mourn. That's a drug user, right? If we think about Mbebe's ideas of necropolitics, policies that actually kill people, and Ruth Wilson Gilmore talking about structural and targeted abandonment. There are people who are targeted that their lives are not even grievable, right? I'm trying to resist that by what we always want to do is think about whose life is most vulnerable, who has the most precarious life. Critical trans theorist Dean Spade would say, who has the least life choices? You know how people's actually accesses to choice in their life get really small because of racism, poverty, incarceration, right? So we track ethics and see who's the most vulnerable, and that's the person you have to center in the conversation. Here's what that looks like in therapy. When I meet with a man who's harmed his wife and children or partner and children, you know, I work with guys who've used violence. I have compassion for that man and I have care for him. And I'm trying to keep him out of jail and I'm trying to keep him on the planet. But I track vulnerability. I'm never doing individual therapy, right? There's never just one person. Even if I'm just meeting with that man who's used violence, his partner who he's harmed and his children are in that room. They're in with me, right? So I tracked vulnerability. Who's the most vulnerable here are the children he hurt. So I'm going to hold them at the center. And all of the conversation that I have with him, I'm going to make sure it takes care of those children. So, you know what I mean? So that would lead me to never side with him when he says something like, well, like I had to hit them. They just wouldn't shut up. You know, when a man is tired and all, you know, all the excuses that he gives, I won't fall for that because I'm tracking the vulnerable. I've got that little boy sitting with me and I'm like, no, I can't let you, that you're wrong. I won't let you do that. You know what I mean?
Oh, that is huge for me right now. Yeah, there's an incident that happened in my area where a young Native man was shot and killed by a police officer, and he was 21.
Oh.
And so I don't know, nobody knows what happened. It's pretty, pretty early in the process. And this is the first time that they've had like a peaceful protest in my area. Like, there's not really a history of that type of thing in, with our Alaska Native people just in that area. And so I've been just you saying that, and I've been really curious, like where I want to be involved, I want to support. And no matter what happened or, to me, who's at fault is not the issue here. The issue is one of, our young people is gone now. And so what happened and how can we have conversations to where those things don't happen. So, so the whole, you talking about this and about the vulnerable, just bringing the vulnerable into balance, that's huge. That's really, and I wish that every system had that mentality. Yeah.
Just think of those ethics. If you're tracking vulnerability, how would that, first of all, I'm so sorry for your loss.
Thank you.
I'm so sorry for your loss.
Thank
and
you.
The fact that it happens so often, that's how we get to be where people are ungrievable. And we're like, oh yeah, Black Lives Matter also involves Indigenous people. It's like, we have to really resist people becoming numbers, right?
Right.
And thinking about, I don't know what's going on in Alaska, but I'll tell you here, in terms of the prison industrial complex, we have gotten rid of so many social workers and so many community workers and so many more people are in poverty that we're shifting a lot more resources to police, right? So, and police cost a lot of money. So I don't know what this person's situation was, but if you're having a mental health crisis in Canada, they send the police because we've unfunded everybody else. It costs a fortune to send police. So someone's under distress, and like, think if it's a racialized person who's been criminalized or their family's been harmed by that structural, like I said, targeted abandonment by the state, right?
Right.
And the person they send to help you is in a uniform and they have a gun, and it's a person you've never met, usually a man, And often, like a white man with a gun in a uniform you've never met, that's supposed to help you with your health emergency. Well, in a 2-month period in Canada last year, this is just 1 2-month period, Canadian police shot 6 people of color dead on mental wellness checks. First of all, why are the police even doing mental wellness checks? The last thing that would help me if I was in any kind of distress or suffering is sending a police officer with a gun. I don't need a police officer with a gun coming to respond to my distress. What I want is a neighbor or an elder woman or a First Nations person, or some, like resource communities. The poster that's right behind me here says, "We keep us safe." Who keeps us safe? We keep us safe. So what we've done is we've moved all these resources, and Angela Davis and other great abolitionists will tell you about this. We've moved all these resources from social services, from the social net, into the prison industrial complex, into policing, so that now when you're in emotional distress, a police officer with a gun comes and not rarely shoots people dead. And like I said, 6 people of color shot dead in mental wellness checks in a 3-month period in Canada. No white people were killed. Police officers of whatever race they are were somehow able to see a white person in distress as a person in distress. But any person of color in distress was seen as a threat and shot dead. Yeah. This is structural, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. This is real. So I think we have to have an analysis about this, and thinking about this. So when we talk about, abolition, I'm with Angela Davis. No prisons, no police, no surveillance. If we actually use our resources by moving communities out of poverty and resourcing communities, we know how to take care of each other. And communities of struggle, queer communities, activist communities, refugee communities, Indigenous communities have always kept each other safe. We are not the people who call the police when we're in distress. I grew up in a very working class neighborhood where there was some criminalization going on and stuff. I grew up hearing, if you think any situation can't get worse, call a police officer, because anything can get worse for somebody. And if you grew up thinking that if there's a problem, you call the police and their first thought is your safety, that acknowledges that you've had a life of privilege, because that's a very rare experience for anyone from communities of struggle. Queer people, people of color, Indigenous people, activists, refugees. The last thing you think is going to make something better is a police officer with a gun, right?
Right.
Yeah. I don't know. I hope I'm not getting.
No, that was really.
You're talking about your beautiful human who's been lost. Yeah.
No, that was really good information, because I'm pretty new to this, and so are a lot of people in that community. So that type of dialogue is really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I think a Black friend of mine, Sasha Medine, gave me some language that I'm going to offer to you. I don't know the situation of your person, so I'm not talking about him. But when George Floyd was murdered by that police officer, a white police officer, and people were watching, and I said that it was a police killing, Sasha said, "Vikki, that's a white way to look at that. This was a lynching. As a Black man, he sees this as a lynching." He said if he had thrown a rope over a pole and lynched him and suffocated him, had him die like that, it's exactly the same. Like, don't talk about this as a police killing, because sometimes those happen from car accidents or, stray bullets or something. This was a lynching. And just having, Wittgenstein says, right, the limits of my language are the limits of my world. Using mutualizing language that absolves perpetrators and hides the violence, the true violence of it. It's so much more than a killing when it's done by the state. And I've gotten myself into some trouble, just trouble of backlash and having to defend it, which is defendable. I've worked with survivors of torture, and I know what torture is. I know what political violence is. Political violence is when an agent of the state is the one perpetrating the violence and has impunity to do that that's actually political violence. That's not just violence. It's not just an assault. For example, if a police officer rapes a woman who's a sex worker, which is a scenario I'm often involved in in my support of sex workers, that's not a sexual assault. That's actually political violence, because that's an officer of the state who has the whole apparatus of the state behind him and has the impunity to do that. Do you see what I'm talking about here? It's and I don't mean to minimize sexual assault, but this isn't just sexual assault. Because it's agents of the state, this is actually political violence and torture. And that's why residential schools throughout all of Turtle Island, it's not actually abuse that people suffered. It was political violence and torture. And we haven't come to accepting that language yet, but that is an accurate description of what happened. State-sanctioned violence with absolute impunity. I don't believe anybody's ever gone to jail for the harms they caused Indigenous people in the United States or Canada. It's just as if there's like historical thing that's been forgotten, Anyway, this is impunity. And that's what makes it state violence, right? There is something different when we're in, when we have a prison industrial complex, that's, I just think we have to use words accurately to describe the violence and where it's coming from. This is not one bad police officer. This isn't personal. Like Angela Davis said, I have a structural analysis, I have critique of policing. It's not personal about individual people who do that work. And your brain looks really busy, Doris. I'm wondering what you're making of what I've been laying out here.
Oh, I just think that all of this is very timely, and I'm just kind of taking it all in and absorbing it to bring it back to who needs to hear this. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And I also I believe in these situations that the healing has to be communal as well, right? This isn't an individual loss. This is like really systemic and is tied to all other kinds of historic oppression against Native Alaskans since invasion. We have to put things within their political context, right? And that's a problem of psychology or psychotherapy, where if you or someone else in your community was trying to access a therapist about how to respond to this, being met with basically white supremacist psychotherapy ideas of like grief and loss, where the first stage is managing your anger and the second stage is acceptance. You can't accept this. It's unacceptable and it's ongoing. And it's a piece of state violence that's been going on since occupation, right? If I could just say something about that, the first stage of grief and loss counseling for people of color to be managing their anger. Who's not allowed to be angry? Black women. Black women get shot and killed for being angry in public. Truly. Who has permission to be angry? And so here's psychotherapy, I think, working in a real colonizing white supremacist way to try to do anger management on people who actually need to out their rage. It's not anger, it's enraged. And I think a lot of the people I work with who are responding to all of these political deaths, everybody dying of over what's called drug poisonings or overdoses, the people responding to this, I believe there's something new going on. It's not, grief and loss won't do it because they're trying to mourn amidst atrocity. But I think what's actually happening is an enraged grief. And particularly workers who are drug users or peer workers or don't have academic degrees, they're seen as less professional. They're not allowed to be angry at work. And their friends are dying and they're enraged about that. And then they're trying to show up in these, quote, professional ways. It's really abusive. Structurally, right? So I'm trying to find space for us to outrage.
Yeah, and so, sorry, Christian, I just do one more question. How do you do that? How do you create that space for that? Because in Alaska Native communities, there are some things that happen that don't happen in a lot of places. And because they're so small and a very small population, how do you create that space for people to be outraged? Culturally, I feel like culturally, like for my culture anyway, being outraged is not very acceptable. So how, for Indigenous people is what I'm thinking, like, how do you create that space for them to just be like, hey, it's okay to be angry?
Well, I'd back off here. I'm talking about working with people who are drug users who are enraged and want to out their rage. I
Oh,
don't
okay.
know. I don't know if that would be something, you would collaborate with. I mean, I don't know if that's something that's required. That might just be, if I came in as a therapist and said, okay, we're going to out our rage, that would be so culturally inappropriate. That would be,
Yeah.
that would be a real white supremacist practice. I know you guys are all pissed off. Let me show you how we do it. Punks like me who are tattooed and working class and swear. Here's how we roll. But that's not a cultural fit. But I think
Right.
people have to, what I do think from working with communities of survivors of torture, like the Chilean community, the Iranian, working within communities who are trying to make repair together, that you have your own cultural ways, practices, and knowings that are so much more useful than anything from that, quote, therapy has to offer in terms
Right.
of grief and loss, right? Let's remind ourselves we're involved in a pretty white supremacist project in psychotherapy, the ways psychotherapy and colonization fit together. Alan Wade and Nick Todd wrote an article called Psycolonization, the ways psychology replicates colonization. And it was really illuminating. I have a PhD in psychology. I am a psychotherapist, but I don't think it's a neutral project, right? I'm very critical of the ways that I engage. And, I think that and I think this is something Christian was talking about at the beginning as well. How do we make space for Native Alaskan ways of knowing and culture, ways of being to respond to this, right? That, I would be led in collaborate. I don't think I would be qualified to help at all, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I wouldn't go there and collaborate. I would just, I think that how do we, and that's what I was saying in terms of promoting communities to help. How do we resource that community to do what it knows how to do is the question, not how do we throw a bunch of, no matter what the culture of the person is, someone who's been through a white process of psychotherapy, helicoptering them in like they're going to fix this. That's, how do we reject that and support what's already there and resource people to do that collectively, right?
Right. And every community is different, right?
Yeah.
In my area, we can be an hour apart and there still are very unique characteristics of each community. So that's great, is just allowing them to create their own spaces for that.
Yeah.
I think you brought up a good point, though, Doris. I think maybe it's a rhetorical question, but do Alaska Native folks, do they have the right to be angry? And I don't mean that like a literal right, but I mean, if an Alaska Native were to express anger in a certain venue about anything, how would it be perceived and how would it be responded to? And I would say that it would be responded negatively, and much like you're talking about maybe how the black woman would be perceived, it'd be the angry Native versus a culture of listening and reflecting on what they had to say. And so I don't know, do you have any thoughts on that, Doris? Let me add just a little bit to that. I would think that even here at the university, right, it's a very docile culture at this point, right? There's not resistance, or there's no speeches going on, or there's not resistance shows on the radio, or there's no real outlet for those kind of things. And so do you know what I mean? So historically, there's a lot of things to be angry for. There's plenty of things that are to be angry for in the present. Even if you're just talking about subsistence rights and things like that, right? But if somebody were to come in, whether it was to Juneau or to Anchorage or even to a town hall meeting or something like that, or a tribal meeting, and they were angry about it, many of the people in Alaska would just view the Alaska Native person or the group of people as being angry and completely dismiss anything that they had to say without ever taking the time to listen and to reflect on what they had to say. And I wonder how we change that, but just wondering your thoughts on that, Doris.
I'm kind of wondering, because I'm not a person to speak, I'm not a cultural expert or anything like that. I've just lived within my culture, and culturally for me in my area, we are very careful in what we say about things. And my own theory of that is it was for survival. We had small communities back then, and we were hunting and gathering, and any kind of conflict could mean somebody could die, somebody could starve, somebody, any kind of conflict or any kind of separation could be very fatal. And so we have a lot of cultural aspects that kind of drive us towards unity. And it's beautiful. I mean, it's so beautiful, and I love that. And there are, I think, healthy ways to get across different types of like anger or emotion, that type of thing. And I do really feel like there's a call for that. I really do. And so what does that look like? I don't know. But I do feel like that is a piece of communication that could be kind of fostered a little bit more, within my community anyway.
I just, while you're saying that, I just remember having conversations with some of my students, Christian, or people I supervise, at the beginning of Black Lives Matter, where someone in a group actually said, I could understand their situation more if they weren't so angry. They're screaming at us. They're screaming at us, and I feel really accused, which I guess is just a picture of white fragility, right? And what was lovely is I didn't even have to respond. Luckily, other white people in the group responded and said, that's exactly the problem. That infuriates me. Like, I'm infuriated hearing that, and I'm a white person. This idea, like, why do you think people scream? People scream because they haven't been heard. I think, who's the person? Was it Martin Luther King that said a riot is the soundtrack of the voiceless? Might have been Martin Luther King. I mean, but what I think about is I don't remember the name. There was an Indigenous woman therapist wrote an article recently about how in therapy, Indigenous women are being taught how to be polite white women. That the goals of what's mentally well for a woman is to be, heterosexual, middle class, quiet, and these kind of ways that, it's actually a practice of assimilation. Therapy is, And another scholar, a therapist, a woman of color, wrote an article called The Making of White Women, how therapists meet women of color and just try to help them behave like a nice middle-class white woman. And I read those things as a white person, feeling very implicated. And I thought it was useful for me to feel implicated in that, As a working class person, I'm not as taken to that because it's that middle classness, but I am white, and I didn't feel called out at all. I felt like someone is revealing to me the ways therapy is working in terms of assimilation under a supposed feminist lens, right?
I can say that there are some women like that are just popping into my mind they communicate so well, like Jody Potts. She's done work, land protection work, and Princess. She's done some amazing work. And Georgiana Lincoln was in the Senate, and she had a very strong voice for Alaska Native, just for where we wanted to be and where we wanted to go. So there are people who are paving that way and who have been.
All right, we have some activity in the chat that I think is worth going into, but we also have a caller here, and so she's been waiting for a minute. And so I'm going to bring Minnie on. She's from my rural cohort.
Hello?
What's up, Minnie? Can you hear us?
Yeah, but I hear that really. Oh, there, it's gone. Hi. I just wanted to bring up some valid points to Vikki because what you're talking about is really, really good, information. I never heard anyone who talked about, oh, I'm a white person. Let me see that's so unique. It's so I got so excited and goosebumps, like, oh. But I just wanted to make some points on what you guys are talking about. Native people and non-white people are so ignored to a point to where we don't matter. And there's so many examples of that throughout the news in Alaska, and there's so many examples of what happened. Like there's a time when there was a white lady that was missing, that was taken. I think it was Samantha Koenig or something, with Berisha. She was taken and abducted, and she was missing. And all these people, the news was on her, everything, and they even did a GoFundMe to reward the person who took her. Oh, please bring back our daughter. But at the same time, there was a Native lady that went missing, and no one knew, and there was no news coverage on her. There was nothing on that. And when they did find a lady, Samantha, they had a whole big candle vigil. Everything was all on the white lady, and no Native lady was left in the dark. No news coverage, no nothing, no investigation. Ruled as died of element outside. But her death was so suspicious because she went missing in this area of Anchorage, and she was found in a different area, like she was dumped off, and she was she was completely ignored, completely everything. And still to this day, people don't know how she passed away, because the medical examiners didn't do a good, they said, oh, she just died of natural elements and stuff. But there was some, like I said, those red flags, whatever, but it was still ignored because she was Alaska Native. And then and going back to I had to write notes because I forget. Yeah, I don't do good brain activity. Just kidding. But like there was some disturbing images because there's in the news there was a black man that was his neck was being like his. Do you remember that incident where a police officer was putting his knee on a black man's neck and he died from the incident? And it's just so horrific because, we have these white shooters shooting up schools, shooting up malls and everything. And they're being handled with so much love and so much care. Like, oh, they're sitting down with their hands behind their back. They're giving water. They're making sure they're being taken care of, as opposed to the black people or non-white people are being like mishandled and beaten up and all that. And like, there's so many instances, like I can go on and go on and go on and go on, but and I had my own incident, like where, I was assaulted by my, younger brother by trying to help him, but he was intoxicated. And when the police finally came, because of the extent of the assault, I was very lightheaded and everything. I just collapsed, and they automatically assumed I was intoxicated, which I wasn't. I was just, it's a traumatic experience from being assaulted. Like, it's like, woof. And it was just crazy. And then my husband and I talked about this too. It was just random conversations, and he did share an incident where him and his sister were in a vehicle accident that they weren't responsible for, but they're in a town where it's all white, and the people who caused the accident, they took care of them. They towed their truck, everything, but they left them and his sister, who was pregnant at the time, to do things. And just call a tow truck and go walk down there and do this, and it's totally ignored and completely ignored. And I really do believe kind of like a little bit white supremacy does still live. And I really love the fact that you stated that we do have the right to be angry and to express our anger and not to be suppressed for so long, because we've been suppressed over 200 or more years and not being able to voice our concerns and stuff like that. And usually I say like there's a saying where I forgot like when we finally respond with anger and hurt and are able to fully express ourselves, it's viewed as, oh, it's not good, or you're not whatever. And that same thing with the people in the Lower 48. Like when there's a shooting, when it's a non-white person, it's seen as a terrorist threat. But when it's a white person, it's seen as, oh, a person with mental health issues. It's crazy. But I was just wondering, like, because I didn't even know growing up, I always thought, oh, the police are always right. The police are always good and stuff like that, right? Or the white people are always right. They're always good. They know, but no, that's not right all the time. And we did like an activity in Diane McCachran's class where we were like able, are you, unconsciously biased? And they take a test and you see if you are. And somewhat I was a little bit, but they did this to police officers, and they were unconsciously biased. And like, I don't know, how do you bring that to people? Like, how do you educate people more? Like, I wouldn't say white people, but more people, like how, I don't know where to start or how to start, but how would you say, how should people educate themselves on this topic, and both white and Native people? Because like I said, we're still like this in today's society, not like that. So like, how do we educate more people, I don't know if I'm making sense, so I'll just be quiet, but that's all. The only thing I can think of, like when we start at schools, I would really think like that's where it begins, is at school, when they're younger, like kind of like coach them and stuff. And I'm not saying that Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh no, thanks so much for speaking here. I really appreciate that and for everything you laid out there. Um, in Canada, we use the language of the missing women, girls, and women, missing Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirit people. And this is when you talked about the Alaskan Native woman who went, quote, missing and was found dead, and how there's no investigation into the violence of her death. Whereas when a white woman dies or is missing, there's this like massive response and everything. Um, that's exactly, that's a beautiful and heartbreaking example, many of what I'm talking about precarious lives, about what Judith Butler's saying about some people's lives are not worthy of grieving. Some people's lives are not worthy defending. And I think about Black Lives Matter. Um, the response to that, right? Everybody's saying everybody's lives matter. It's like, you've just shown you don't get it. We're just saying there's something very particular about the ways Black people are targeted for death. And I think how we get an education is listening to things like Black Lives Matter. I've had such an education on anti-Black racism and my own relationship to white supremacy by reading and listening and being informed by Black Lives Matter. And I think there's so much that's useful and good that people can learn. I guess I would just say I'm Irish, and there's an Irish playwright, Samuel Beckett, who says, you can wake up a dog who's sleeping, but you can't wake up a dog that's pretending to sleep. Do you get that? You can wake up a dog that's sleeping, but you can't wake up a dog that's pretending to sleep. I believe most white people are just pretending to sleep. They know damn well that children of color are at greater risk from the police. They know damn well they're on someone else's land. They know residential schools, there wasn't just rape and abuse, that children were murdered. They know all that now. And they're working really hard to not know that. You know what I mean? I think a lot of white people are pretending to sleep. Like I said, the media not using the word Palestine, but only using the word Gaza, refusing to acknowledge Palestine as a nation. They know Palestine's a nation, right? So when I guess my response to you is it a problem of people not knowing things, or people of power not wanting to acknowledge what they absolutely know? And I want to thank you for sharing those heartbreaking stories. They are so familiar to me. They're so familiar to me, right? In terms of the missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirit people, the ways that white women who are missing, the ways that we mobilize to try to make that okay, and the ways that Indigenous women are even murdered, and we're trying to make sure that that's understood as suicide or addiction or the elements, So I just, I'm just in solidarity with you, Minnie, and I really appreciate you bringing forward your own wisdom and knowing of these things. Yeah. I wonder what you're making of what I said, Minnie.
It's still processing the native English. Kidding, no. um, just kidding. It's great. I really, everything you're talking about makes sense, and I really appreciate it. And like I said, people like Christian and Vikki and Diamond Cochran, of white people are very rare, and very, very we're excited when there's more of you guys.
Wow. Yeah. Thanks for that, Minnie. Yesterday, I was given a workshop and I acknowledged Palestine. And someone in the chat wrote and said, thank you for naming that. I'm Palestinian. And I wrote them back and said, you don't have to thank me. This is what's required. So I would say the same to you, Minnie. I just feel witnessed and seen by you and very respected. Thank you so much. Yeah. Thanks for
Yeah, well,
that.
I think the opposite of oppression or addiction and all of these things is connection. And so I just like that you just pointed out the little story of connection, Minnie. That was cool.
Yeah.
That's what it's all about. Well, thanks for calling in, Minnie. It's always good to have you as usual. I hope that you'll be back on the podcast in the spring. Let's see. I think we have a few more people. Good question. Just a second. I think I might be able to kick you out.
Oh, bye, Minnie.
There you go. All right.
Wait,
So we
maybe
have
5 minutes?
what's that?
Is 5 minutes good
For
for us?
5 minutes left?
Yeah, is that okay?
Yeah, I was just gonna ask if any of the other people that we're gonna call in had any questions. It's time to call in if you're ready. I did want to acknowledge some of the comments in the chat. Fawn says, I want to thank both of you for sharing these experiences because it gives space for other white people to know this is part of this life and they are not alone when these experiences happen to them. I think this is August Michelle AM. She wants to know, what kind of therapy do you use?
Well, I've been trained up as a narrative therapist, very informed by the collaborative therapist, but I don't actually think what I do is therapy. I think what I'm doing is a political witnessing. So I think of the work that I do as a collaboration between people. That's like a dialogical thing. Yeah, those kind of ideas.
All right. Well, I think I was looking for a David and Shannon. Are you two there? You gonna call in? Give them just a minute. Let's see. I know that we touched real quick, Vikki, on, and I pushed us away from it, but how does activism intersect with therapy?
Well, that's why I think what I'm doing is trying to, like, when I describe the kind of therapy, I don't really think of what I'm doing as therapy. I think psychotherapy has a very important history with objectivity and neutrality. You know, diagnosis, looking at the facts, making a diagnosis, making a treatment plan, treating people like they're broken cars. I think when you approach it from a social justice perspective, you're looking at the political context of things and you're not neutral or objective about any of it. I'm actually against sexual assault. I'm against racism. I'm not neutral or objective about any of that. So I think of a lot of the work that I do with people as solidarity work. The supervision groups I run, I call them solidarity groups. It's more about how do we hold each other collectively to do ethical ways of being with each other. And I've written a lot about these ideas. But in particular, I think it's about the ethical orientation of the work that puts things within a political context. I never see people as addicted, mentally ill, or traumatized. I see people as oppressed and suffering and responding to mean politics. So I think that's like one way of thinking about it.
Thank you for that. I see
Yeah.
we got Shannon. Shannon, you there?
Yeah, thank you. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, and Australia, I was mostly teaching and doing supervision of workers. I wasn't doing like individual therapy with people. Your question about rural work is a really good one. I think it fits with what Doris was saying about there's ways of being and cultural knowings and ceremonies and histories. And I think that's the start, right? Having things be culturally appropriate, but also, it has to be collaborative. People they have to see something in it for themselves. So I'm not sure, in terms of moving people to activism, I think we want to be really careful not to fetishize particular kinds of activism, like speaking at microphones or being in big, loud marches. Activism can be very small. Taking acts against collective acts and collective accountability against oppression is activism. I think about the ways some therapists write their session notes as activism. Letters I've written for court have actually worked as activism. Not all of therapy can be activism because of the project it is, but there's things that are actually activist involved there, right? Yeah, I hope that is a useful response. Yeah. 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 And I think there's been brilliant leadership from Indigenous people on water. Actually on my door, I have a poster that says Water and Life, support land defenders, support Indigenous land defenders. Like, I think there's a lot going on from Indigenous communities that we can network into and get informed by, Mm-hmm. Mm.
All right. Thank you, Shannon. Thank you, Vikki. And I have David. David, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
You guys hear David?
Can you guys hear me? Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yep. Go ahead.
I really appreciate this conversation today. Ladies, thank y'all so much for everything that you guys are saying. I'm a student at UAF, and actually, I'm just now getting into social work. I'm 50 years old. I'm just now getting into school and going to get my BA degree. The thing about it is that I work in social work in the rural areas of Alaska. And what I tend to run into is a lot of generalization of what the young lady was talking about earlier when she was talking about the Chinese did this, and how we can take a whole community without actually just saying who or what did it. I work in a community now where they do a lot of generalization. I work with the Indigenous community. And what I hear from a lot of people within the social work department is these people do this, these people do that. And I feel like that's because I'm a Black man and I'm living in Alaska now. I'm from Detroit, Michigan. I know what that feeling feels like when you generalize a culture of people and don't even know the person. As a social worker, my question is to you guys: what would you tell me, or an up and coming social worker, how to deal with those type of situations?
Well, thanks so much, David, for talking about that, and also for speaking of the intersections of you as a Black man and how much that informs your analysis of being able to catch on when people talk about, quote, these people, right? It speaks to how lived experience is what actually qualifies us to do this work. But I think this is a problem of psychotherapy, period. I mean, the DSM-5, the Diagnostic Statistics Manual, is a way of categorizing people and putting people in, like, this is what psychology does, right? It takes human beings and it categorizes them based on power and based on what's a reasonable human being and what's a reasonable way to be in this world. I would think about who's in solidarity with you where you are, because anti-Black racism is absolutely real, right? And do you have any people working as ally? Like, are there people in ally positions who would stand up? Because you can't do this alone, nor should. That's racism, man. Asking a Black person to revolutionize a place, right? It's like we hired one queer person. Come on, do our pride thing
Right.
for us. Can't you wear a rainbow? It's like,
Right.
this is white supremacy, right? Where you tokenize people, give them the burden. Is it Mike Dyson wrote a book called Everything But the Burden? Are you familiar with that guy?
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
Mike Dyson
Absolutely.
says, white people, they want jazz, they want to use the N word, they want to call each other bro and all this other shit, but they don't want their kids shot. They don't want to be incarcerated, So I just think
Right.
about who is in solidarity with you, who else can take up some of this so it's not all on you. And also, congratulations to all of us for having you join this field at 50. I didn't finish my PhD till I was 48, so I don't think it's ever too late to do useful things.
Wow.
But we need you in this movement, but it can't be on your back alone, man. Like you got to be held up, and there's got to be space for you. So, yeah, I one of the things I say to a lot of my PhD students who are in locations of like being the only queer person or being the only trans person, it's like, your job's to get through this. Your job is not to teach this whole organization how to not be transphobic, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's the
Right.
burden. That's the burden. Yeah. I hope I'm making some sense to you.
Oh, you make plenty of sense. I appreciate even you saying that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks. And stick with it. We need you in the field. We need you. We need you in the field. We do. We
I'm
do.
hoping to get my PhD one day, just like that. I'll be
Awesome.
59 when I get it, but I'm
Doesn't matter.
hoping to get my PhD.
Well, the point of a PhD is to make a contribution to the field, right? And I think that's what you're going to do.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. That's exactly what I want.
Mm.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, David. All right, I had another call coming in. August, Michelle, is that you?
Yes. Good morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
I just wanted to comment that I super appreciate everyone's ideas and opinions, and I really like where Minnie was going with the water and how it's important. But my question to you, Vikki, is where are you basing your research on Israel and Judea and Samaria? Like, where your opinions and ideas, like where exactly are you getting your information from?
Yeah, I would say Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn, I think in particular, historically. And Noam Chomsky's, there's a couple of, actually, he's been putting out some really useful lectures on YouTube right now. And that's been what's really been mostly informing what I'm doing. And also, I guess, Angela Davis's work on Palestine. Like I said, she's been talking about this forever. So just listening, just trying to be led by activists, in particular activists of color and Arab people and Jewish people and what they think. So that's where I've been informed.
Okay, because that was really fascinating to hear your stance, because my family is actually from Spain, Morocco, and Lebanon, and we're of Jewish descent and originally from Israel. And I don't know, not many people talk about that there's 50 Arab nations in the world, and there's only one Jewish state. And a lot of people, Arab people who live in Palestine, have the exact same freedoms in Israel that they would, for example, in Europe and the United States. And I don't hear a lot of people speaking about that and speaking about the Arab Israelis that were kidnapped and tortured by the Hamas. So have you heard of anything about that? And what is your stance on that?
Well, I think that's what the certainly the Western media is totally covering. Yeah. So, and I'm against terrorism. So that's what I said that massacre was horrific. Yeah, perpetrated by Hamas. Yeah, I think
Okay.
I think we can hold, as activists say, we can walk and chew gum. We can hold multiple ethical centers. We can, and we must, I think, be against a terrorist attack by Hamas, and that doesn't make it okay for occupied people to be decimated and they're, with a warlike attack.
Yeah, and I don't, occupation, I'm not really sure about that term, but, it's just finding that the common ground. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you
I think, I
for
think the
clarifying.
common, yeah, thanks for that. You know what? This is the messiest thing of our times. I appreciate you calling and the moral courage it takes to ask me. I don't have the right answers on this. I'm talking about my positioning, how I've been educated as a very Marxist, anti-imperialist informed activist by that. So that's where the teachings have come for me. And that would, and I think, I think we just need to have a lot more conversation so people, I do think we need to have an absolute ceasefire. We have to stop the violence. Just like, it's interesting because this is for therapists, right, Christian? Like, if you're working in a family where there's violence, you don't need to figure out who's done it first. The first thing you need to do is stop the violence, right? And that's what I think that's why that's why I'm calling for a ceasefire now on all sides.
Yeah.
Right? You have to stop the violence before you can start to make sense of any of it.
Right. And I think a lot of people classify Jews as white, but I just wanted to add in our DNA, it will show that we're Semitic or to the area of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And I think actually, unfortunately, but interestingly enough, Hitler proved that Jewish people are a specific ethnic race. And you could just do a quick Google search on that and it will pop up.
Well, I guess what I would say about this is I'm Irish. I'm Irish Catholic. And I grew up with
I have an Irish grandfather.
I grew up with the history of the Irish struggle happening in my family and my history. And always the corporate media talking about it as Protestants against Catholics. That was never what it was. It was England as an imperial state occupied Ireland. And Ireland was trying to throw off their occupiers. And who England moved in to occupy were Protestant settlers. And that's who the Irish were trying to move out. So although the world looked at this as Protestants and Catholics, it was just about occupation, So I think that, like we don't have enough analysis about occupation that we've been taught about, There's histories of this very similar to where I'm standing now as a white occupier of Indigenous territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh people, right? Yeah. All these things are interconnected. And then looking at, for me, looking at what's my accountability here? How am I benefiting from this? What am I required to do? And for me, I guess the other thing I would say, as a First Nation, as a white settler in Indigenous territory, taking a lead from Indigenous people. What is it people are asking me? What is it people are asking me? My solidarity team, I have many Indigenous people who actually inform what I publish, what I write, what work I take, what work I don't take, who I work with, because I believe that to work in a decolonizing way, I need to be informed and actually at times led by Indigenous people. So that's about, so for me, I don't think about Palestine and Israel without thinking about myself as an occupier of Indigenous territory. Start where you're standing, That brings a lot of humility to it. Yeah.
Yeah, wow, that's really in-depth. Thank you for your time.
Well, thanks for your questions. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Yeah, before you leave, August, I just wanted to say thank you for calling in. I think that these conversations are extremely important, and you added a lot of context and it's even things for me to think about. So I appreciate, the coming on here and, challenging us a little bit. But also, are you in 342 next semester?
I can't remember.
I think you are, but
I'm in ethics. Okay, I'm in ethics, and then I'm taking another ethics class.
Oh, okay. Well, I think you'll be with me. If you're not next semester, you'll be in the part 2 of the class you're in this semester. And we focus on person and environment. And so I would love to have your context and dive into that further. I think it's a great, great, maybe not to be the, but it's a good place to explore considering the current context of what's happening in the world. And I would really appreciate your input on that. Maybe we can chat about that as I plan the course.
Yeah, that would be awesome. Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you everybody for giving me the chance to speak and think about, both sides of Israel and Judea and Samaria and the Gaza Strip.
Yeah. Thank you, Michelle.
Okay.
August, Michelle.
All right. Yep, all good. Be well. Bye.
Yep. Have a good day. All right. Well, we had a lot of good callers. I think that ups the podcast significantly when we do have participation. We are a little bit over. I guess we're not overtime. We're over the time we planned.
Yeah, we did.
And so I just want to move us forward. And I want to start with you, Doris. And I just want to ask you, have any last words? Anything you want to say?
I just wanted to thank you both, Christian, for this platform, for the conversation. Having these conversations it just has grown me, and I'm sure grows listeners as well. Vikki, thank you so much for your dialogue and for what you've taught me today. I think that some of the things that you were saying, like, it's almost like just putting your ego aside when you were learning, like you're learning when you go into Indigenous cultures, when you go into other cultures and other environments, how you were talking about just keeping an open mind and not getting offended. It's kind of like putting that ego on the shelf and being open to learning. That was one of the big takeaways for today. And thank you for that conversation. I just wanted to mention his name, my little cousin, my little nephew that was involved in the incident. His name was Timothy Thomas Jr. And I just wanted to just give him honor, his short life here on earth. And thank you for that conversation about activism around that and about police violence. Thank you.
Doris, it's so important that you say his name, right? And
Yeah.
that's something from Black Lives Matter. It's like we've got to say his name. So I'm also so sorry for the loss of Timothy. Yeah.
Thank you.
And thanks for your way of being today. I really appreciated having you with us. I enjoyed our interactions. It was sweet.
Thanks. Me too.
Yeah, and I want to say personally, from me to you, Doris, from my heart to yours, thank you for everything that you've done to contribute to this episode. And it's been great to get to know you, and I look forward to continuing to get to know you as we move forward in our academic journeys together. And again, it's just been a pleasure working with you. So thank you very much for your contribution. I really appreciate it. And Vikki, I want to turn it over to you. You have any last words before we get out of here?
Oh, no, just thanks so much for having me here. And I've really appreciated how organic it was. And I hope that I haven't transgressed. And yeah, a lot of my answers were really not well thought out. And I'm sure everybody has grace for that. But I've really appreciated this. And I love how organic it is. And I want to thank everybody who called in. That was really wonderful. And I think took some moral courage. And I thought that's what dialogue requires, right? So thanks so much. Thanks for inviting me. I'm very humbled and thankful that to Doris and Christian, to both of you for having me here. Thanks.
Yeah, and thank you for blessing us with your time, with your wisdom, with your knowledge, with your experience. Yeah. And I think it's important that we take the time for these long-form conversations and that we don't expect ourselves to be perfect in the things that we say and whatnot, and we're willing to reflect and be corrected and correct ourselves and do the best we can to move forward and become better human beings and become a part of it and reconnect ourselves. And that's the best that we can do. So I appreciate you sharing this space with us. Big thank you from my heart to yours. Thank you for everybody that participated from the audience. Fawn, David, Minnie, August, who else am I missing? Shannon. Thank you everybody for your participation. Really, really appreciate it. You're what makes the podcast go round. I'll get this up and produced in the next couple weeks and get it sent out. Thanks again, everyone. We'll close it out and I'll get this up as soon as possible. Take care, everyone.
Bye now.
Peace.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye now.
This episode of The Critical Social Worker was recorded live on Thursday, November 30th, 2023. Today's episode featured Vikki Reynolds, and it was hosted by Christian Ace Stettler and Doris Miller. You've been listening to The Critical Social Worker, a revolutionary storytelling podcast. Your story, my story, our story. All right, everybody, until next time, keep being revolutionary. Peace.